Hello and welcome to Setting the Stage, episode 55, Ben and Midgard. Alright, today I'm here with Ben. We have a couple different Bens in the podcast, but this is Ben and Midgard. So, hi Ben.
Hi. Thanks for having me tonight, Isaac.
Yeah, happy to have you. So before we get into talking about RPGs and all of that, let's hear about who Ben is outside of RPGs.
Sure. So I served in the Air Force for a few years. I
Cool.
did a stint in I guess I like to say high-end corporate tech support for Solaris for Fortune 5. Well, I did kernel support, right? So that's
Okay.
like I handled core dumps for Solaris systems for a bunch of years, and
Okay, the way you
after
were saying it, I was assuming like high end meant like you were doing the nice, well dressed person that goes and helps the CEO that doesn't know how to use a mouse.
no, that was part of my time in the Air Force actually.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
But yes, no, I worked for Sun Microsystems doing Solaris core file analysis for
Okay,
the
cool.
super nerds out there. And then after that, I transitioned. I work in cybersecurity now for New York State.
Oh, nice. My dad did some work for Sun. He runs he ran a technical writing company that did the documentation for the Sunspot.
Nice. I think Solaris is a underrated gem. It's sad to see it being sunset, but in any case, that is another lifetime. So
Yeah,
that's what I do now, and I freelance game design for coming up on 20 years this
yeah,
spring.
yeah. You have impressive bibliography compared to a lot of the people I've talked to.
I've made dozens of dollars, Isaac, dozens.
Yes, but you have so many credits, though. Not like author credits.
It's a place of love. I do it because I like making stuff for people to play with.
Yeah.
So it's good times.
Well, what brought you to RPGs in the first place?
Oh gosh. So a hojillion years ago, the kids on my street were playing the Errol Otis Moldvay D&D, and they were older than me by a couple years, and I thought that they were super cool. Like I was always the younger kid tagging along. I couldn't have been more than like 5 or 6, honestly. And I would tag along, and I made character sheets on pieces of notebook paper. They gave me the book. I think I begged my parents to buy me a the old red Errol Otis book, right, with the guy fighting the dragon with the
Huh?
sorceress on the cover. And I would make my character sheets off the back of that on a piece of notebook paper. And the guys I played with I played like a fighter, right? Because that was the easiest thing, and I was young, and they're like, you can play a fighter, and I was like, okay. So I did that, and I would go and play with them a few times. I remember playing Keep on the Borderlands, a couple of different things, and a bunch of the old school first edition adventures. But I would play with them, and I did that for on again, off again for the first like 2 years or so, and then my family moved up the hill about a half mile, and I landed on a street that had like 4 guys my age, and one of them's older brother played, so he had a character from playing with his older brother, and we basically made a table. Well, it wasn't so much a table as like we'd play in the garage, or we'd play we play wherever we got space to play. And I started playing with them, and yeah, and I played with them for a bunch of years, in through the Satanic Panic. That was crazy talk in the 80s.
Nice.
Yeah, and I took a break at one point for a couple of years, because the Satanic Panic was kind of crazy. My parents were concerned, and I was like, I don't have to keep playing. I can quit. And they're like, oh, okay. And so then I quit for like 2-3 years, and then another guy moved in to our neighborhood in middle school, and he had played with his older brother, and he was like, you guys want to play D&D? And then I just broke out all the old books. I was probably like, I don't know, 13 at the time, and never stopped after that. It's been 36 years of just constant play since then.
Damn. Yeah. Well, what you said there about like writing your character on like pieces of note paper, it's just reminded me that I miss like physical character sheets now that I'm playing digitally so much.
I have a terrible habit. I like treeware. I like to put my stuff on paper. Like even when I play a game that's online for something, I'll generate the PDF or I'll use D&D Beyond, but I'll print something out to have in front of me while we're playing so I can have that. I have to have the tangible sheet to look at and review.
It is so much nicer to like look through notes that way because you can have, you can sort of have your thumb on different places and go back and forth, whereas like it's not as easy to do that with like a digital PDF.
No, I feel like even with a shared like Google Doc or a notepad that you have kind of going there, stuff can get lost. Now it's nice to be able to go back and Control F.
Yeah, that part you can't duplicate.
No, I have to put like Post-its in notebooks for that to mark important points, right?
Yeah.
So I don't miss that. But with as good as Google Lens is now, I tend to, after I get done with a session, capture what I have on my notebook and put it into the Google Doc so I can do that for later on. And then usually I can jump back and forth. But yeah, I have to have the treeware. I'm a sucker for the treeware.
Yeah, I still like rolling physically if my DM lets me get away with it. Whenever I'm the DM, I do that on Roll20. I never roll using the system if I'm the DM. I just use real dice.
Yeah, I will play on Discord. Do a lot of Theater of the Mind for two of my 3 games, and Avre is a fickle bot. I would prefer to use dice. I think they would prefer to use dice. They don't trust Avre.
Yeah, and I feel like if you've been with a group for a long time, usually you can just sort of, we're not going to cheat, guys. Just roll. And
yeah. And I have one player who does, but he makes his own dice. So I kind of feel obligated to let him roll his own dice.
Yeah, shave a little bit off of the one.
Oh, he does really cool stuff. Like he made some awesome Cthulhu ones for me that had like tentacles inside of them for Christmas one year.
That's cool.
I embarrassment of riches on that table. So yeah, so then I've been playing basically ever since, and I played a whole bunch of different stuff, like just a ton of different systems. I've run stuff in like 8 or 9 different systems, and I mean most of those were D&D adjacent, but like 4 were not, and yeah, it's a good time. This is my jam, right? They'll find me in the nursing home, the old people's home at some point. Take my dice from my cold dead body.
When did you make the transition from a player to a DM? Was that when you were like 13 and getting the books back out?
No, I did it first. When I was very young and I arrived on the street, I was the one who had all the source books early on. So I ran stuff then. And then when I quit, right, for the Satanic Panic, when I quit, we kind of quit on the street for a while, but then those same guys broke out. And then when we kicked it back on and they were like, hey, do you want to play? I was like, I know how to run. And then, yeah, it was funny all the way with like, an adventurer's almost like, adventuring contract kind of thing of shares of treasure and the whole night. We were like 13, 14. It was ridiculous. But yeah, I ended up the GM there, and I did that all the way up until high school. Although we would trade, there was like 1 or 2 other guys in that group who would swap out every so often, and so I got to play some. Mm-hmm. And then when we got to college, I was mostly the GM in college, except that it was the early mid 90s. So I dabbled with LARPing and got to be a player there.
Yes.
Wandering around the campus with your arms crossed over your chest. No one can see me.
You had the way the spells worked were that way.
That's a deep cut there for my obfuscate there from my Mind's Eye Theater.
Okay.
Yeah. World of Darkness vampire stuff. and I did that for a while, and I helped run a couple of sessions with
Worlds of
Wolfgang.
Darkness. Okay, I was thinking of the LARPing that I saw at my college was like just sort of D&D LARPing.
Amp Guard type stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did a few sessions of that too. I was a fencer through high school and into college, and there was no way I was getting out of college without a couple of hours spent swinging Boffa
Oh,
swords at people.
cool.
So yeah, I was a heavy nerd in college. So comp sci and role playing games and occasionally anime. It was tough to be a little less nerdy.
Okay. Yeah.
I had the trifecta there, right?
I mean, you
So
weren't in theater, so maybe not the whole thing, but.
that was high school. I was the
Oh,
sound crew.
oh, all right, all right. Oh, better crew. Okay. That's cool. Thanks for sharing all that.
No worries.
So we're talking about Midgard today, which
Okay.
is not quite your own campaign setting, although you have contributed significantly to it.
It is actually Wolfgang Baur's old high school setting that he fleshed out and then published. He, in the early aughts, started doing this thing called open design, which was crowdfunding before crowdfunding. And he would basically say, okay, I'm going to design a supplement. And if you guys want to pay, I think at the time it was like $50. Right? If you want to pay $50, you can get an extra vote. Everybody gets a vote, but if you pay $50, you get like 2 votes. And I'm gonna design things, but every so often I'm gonna give you a choice. Like, do you want to, here's like 3 different NPCs, pick 2, right? Or pick 1, and we'd get to vote or help design or play test things or whatever. And he grew that out of open design into being Kobold Press. And so early on, I got in on the like the tail end of the second project, third project, and just fell in love with doing it because I had tried doing some Living Greyhawk design because I got
Hmm.
frustrated at a convention. I was like, I can do better than this. And so I got frustrated and berated the local administration guys to let me try and write an adventure. And I did like 3 or 4 Living Greyhawk things for the because they broke the United States out into regions off the Greyhawk map that were geographic to the United States.
Uh-huh.
And I was here in the Northeast, which included New York City, and it was impossible to get to write very much because there were so many writers in New York City who wanted to contribute. So I ended up doing a ton of stuff for the guys down in Florida. And I'd done like, I don't know, a half dozen Living Greyhawk things. And I was like, okay, I want to make the next jump to doing things. And I found this from a guy who did a ton of GMing for Living Greyhawk that I had met at a couple of conventions. And he said, this is really cool. And I went and signed up for it, and I was hooked. It was like going to the Renfest where you watch the guy like blowing glass, except he's like making D&D things and asking you your opinion,
Yeah.
right? So, and then from there, I just fell in love with the setting. It was close enough to it was not Earth. I mean, it's flat, which
Uh-huh.
is kind of crazy, and it's not really Europe, but it's kind of Europe. Early on, I kind of cracked the code. I like to describe it to people as Earth, but with the fantasy blur filter on it. And once I kind of realized the underlying elements, I was like, oh, this is fantastic. Because then I really was able to identify how to do design stuff for it. And I just kept writing things and hitting my deadlines and got to write stuff. So
Yeah. Yeah,
that's
that's cool.
fantastic.
Yeah, I didn't know they had like sort of. I mean, I guess I could have conceived of it, but the sort of paid collaborative experience like Kickstarter can be
Yeah.
that existed prior to the internet.
It wasn't, I mean, it was still internet, right? But he would use, and this is also a deep cut. He would use, what was it? LiveJournal. So he had like a LiveJournal page, and
Oh, okay.
everybody had to go pay on PayPal, and we had to reach a certain funding point within 30 days, or he refunded everybody. And it was 30 days because that was how long he had to refund the
Oh, I
first
see.
people, right? After 30 days, he couldn't refund the people on PayPal. So we had 30 days to hit a funding mark. And then everybody who paid got password access to the live journal page. And then we worked off the live journal page. And we did that for, I want to say, like 4 or 5 years. And then he had some forums that he had set up. And at that point, I was working on a couple projects. After 4 or 5 years, I went from being like a playtester patron to playtester small contributor. I mean, I would still sign up as a patron, but I was doing more contributing. And then, gosh, I want to say 2008, 2009, I really got to do more. I got to actually lead a couple projects, and that was where I got my first shot to like lead a project from pitch all the way to the end, like everything in there. It was like adventure anthology and I don't want to say micro setting, but it was a pretty self-contained urban setting in
Uh-huh.
one of the big cities for the setting.
Yeah.
And so we did like a deep dive of the shady part of town, right? The tagline was "Leave the paladin at home." And that one we funded. That was one of the last ones we funded on PayPal. And then after that, we started funding projects. I say we, right? After that, Kobold Press started funding things on Kickstarter.
Oh, I get why you're saying we there. Like you're like a honorary member of the writing
Yes,
staff at the company.
it is funny because for a while, even though I'm just like freelancer, they would go through occasionally social media folks, and I'd be like, "Yeah, back in whenever we would do it this way," and they're like, "How long have you been doing this?" And I was like, "A lot of years, maybe." Usually, it surprised people, but yeah, I've been freelancing with them since probably 2007.
I mean, it sounds like since before they were officially Kobold Press.
They were initially open design, and then they did Cobalt Quarterly. And then as they were doing Cobalt Quarterly, they kind of made the leap from open design to Cobalt Press. So
The one that you were talking about, like the Don't Bring the Paladin, that's the
yeah,
Streets of Zobeck, right?
that was, yeah. And that's the adventure anthology. And the whole thing was I'd gotten the idea for how to put it together from the project before, which was Tales of the Old Margrave, which is great. Like that one is a trip into the deep dark forest, right? But what we did is we kind of pitched adventures and then we built out the forest after the fact. And watching that, I was like, okay, first let's build out the city, right? This under, the shady part of town, and then we'll use what I wanted to call was, or what I would call the kind of thieves world precept, which was we've got all these people and towns and everything, or places of business and everything else, and we can all share them in all of our adventures, but you're not allowed to kill it unless you designed it. So, if you made an NPC, then in your adventure, yeah, you could go ahead and kill him, but nobody else could kill him,
Okay.
kind of thing, in their design. So that everybody had these tools to use, but you didn't get to break it unless you made it. And so we built that all out, and I wish we had put a little more connective tissue between the sections in it. But overall, I was really very proud of that project. It did well. We won a gold ENnie for best adventure, but it's really setting an adventure anthology, together. But it was a great project.
Yeah, that's really cool.
I was very proud of that one.
Well, let's take a step back for Midgard. So you said it's like
Okay.
sort of Europe with the fantasy filter goggles, fog on.
Yeah.
And I mean, Midgard makes me feel like, okay, this is based off of Norse myths, or maybe Final Fantasy VII, because that had Midgard as well.
So like Wolfgang will tell you Eastern European base, and usually we think of Budapest is the touch point for Zobeck, which is kind of that is the big city that sees the most development, the crossroads.
Mhm.
That is the most well-developed point in the setting is Zobeck. And, Wolfgang's heritage comes from Eastern European roots. And so a lot of the gods that are part of the pantheon are at least for that region in particular, kind of have Eastern European sourcing. I think Faerun is actually a historical one. I know
Yep.
Ruthenian Plain, which is to the east of the Crossroads region, is the old name of the language for Ukrainian, because I had a player in my Ars Magica game who pulled it out and put it on his character sheet as one of his languages. I'm like, wait a minute, and he was like, yeah, that's from Ukrainian. I'm like, no, I'm familiar with Ruthenian. It was kind of a funny cross, because I didn't often dive too deep, but you find the underpart, and then when you need to do the research. But yeah, so Midgard is more Eastern European. It's supposed to be a little grimdark. At least that was the initial basis. I feel like it's lightened up a little bit as the years have gone by. It gets a little diluted. I don't say diluted, but it gets a little brighter. I think the wider your audience, a little less grimdark.
Yeah. Well, The Witcher is pretty wide, and it's an Eastern European grimdark setting.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah, and that's fair. Things like that certainly have helped. And it doesn't lean too deep into the edgelord grimdark kind of element. It's
No.
like, we're a little grimdark, but we're not too grimdark, which I really enjoy about the setting. There is room for humor. That was actually a good lesson Wolfgang taught me on more than a couple projects, was, there's got to be room for the humorous pitch in the adventure anthology. Like, it can't all be serious. It can't all be horrible, dark, grim adventures. Sometimes you gotta put the funny one in there as well.
Yeah, I was talking about this with someone in another episode about that you need alternative tones to you need to give people a breath away from all the grimdark stuff if that's the setting you're doing, right?
Absolutely, right. You gotta have a little levity.
And it can't just be time away from the table. It needs to be within the game itself.
Yes. Yeah. Masha the dancing bear is a NPC at one of the taverns in Zobeck, and she's meant to be that contrast of something fun and light in an otherwise, rough and tumble city.
The dancing bear, is this like a intelligent bear or just like a trained animal?
No, she's just a trained animal in that one. The setting later on, as the setting develops over time, like bear folk are a thing. And Masha is not a bear folk. She was just a dancing bear in one of the taverns. And it was one of those things that they kind of put, it was in one of the taverns in, I think she's not in the Hedgehog. I want to say she might be in the Wheat Sheaf. I don't recall which tavern exactly she's in, but she's just a dancing bear. And that's, you get in there and everybody's like, can I talk to her or whatever? I was like, do you have speak with animals? Like, you can speak with animals, sure, but she's probably going to either ask you for meat or a snack. Like, and then the barkeep is probably going to yell at you for interfering with her show. She's just a bear. She's just a bear. Willing to wear a tutu and work for mead. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, it's just a circus act, but inside a bar.
Exactly. It's fun. It's fun to have those, and you have some of that with because kobolds are a big part of that city. I mean, clearly Kobold Press, but they have kobolds in there. Yeah, sometimes it's a tough sell in between trying to make kobolds menacing, in an old school Tucker's kobolds kind of way, but also sometimes they're goofy, right, with wonky traps and squeaky voices.
Oh man, I hate to do this, but I think you have to explain the Tucker's Kobold reference, because I get it, but other people aren't going to.
No, that's fine. Yeah, no. So a bajillion years ago, there was Dragon Magazine was in print, and in the 8 days before the internet, or at least as the internet was just becoming a thing, they would have a whole place where you could send letters into Dragon Magazine, and then they would publish it. One of the letters that got published, if I recall the story correctly, is that this guy wrote in because somebody else had complained in the forum, and that's what they called the place where they put all the letters, was the forum. And someone had complained in the forum that the kobolds were just not even worth their art and their word count in the monster manual, and why would you bother even having them? And this guy told the story of Tucker's kobolds, about how these kobolds had taken over the first layer of the dungeon, and they had kind of honeycomb the whole first level with a set of tunnels that were sized for the kobolds and that would go at different levels across the regular passages and corridors and rooms of the first level of the dungeon. And they would harass any of the adventurers who really wanted to get to the lower levels of the dungeon where all the good treasure was. But these guys, these kobolds had put like pit traps and spear points and places, murder holes to dump oil and all this stuff where they would just terrorize this guy's table. And the GM's name was Tucker. And so they were called Tucker's kobolds. These kobolds would just terrorize these higher level groups because they could not get to the kobolds. And these higher level tables, because he ran at that time the West Marches game before West Marches was kind of a thing. And these different groups that would try and get to the lower levels of the dungeon would really run, right? Invisibility spells and Autoluke's Resonant Sphere and all these things to try and evade the kobolds to get to where there were like demons or ogres, like something that wasn't just going to terrorize them from the hidden corners of the dungeon all the way down.
Right, and this is back when you got gold for experience, right?
Yes.
So,
yes, it was.
like, you could go and kill the kobolds, but they wouldn't have any treasure, so you'd just be kind of wasting your time.
Yeah, spending your spells for the day on stuff that wasn't really going to give you anything worthwhile.
So that's why everyone wanted to skip it and just get to the lower levels, but then the kobolds, like...
They had just basically booby-trapped the whole first level of the dungeon. And so everybody fled. They tried to speed run the first level of the dungeon to get to the lower levels as fast as humanly possible because they were terrified by Tucker's kobolds.
I think another thing they did was like the kobolds would like run away across a hallway, right? And the players would chase after them, and then the hallway would collapse underneath them because the kobolds were too small.
Light.
Yeah,
right. They didn't weigh enough to set off the pit traps, but that human fighter in his full plate, boy, he dropped straight to the spiky bottom.
Yeah, there's so many stories I've heard about that I don't know which one of them are true from the actual original letter, but
yeah, I have to go find it somewhere. I have the CDs somewhere to look at all the old PDFs, and it's searchable. I have to go find, but yeah, that one, those are almost as bad as like Tomb of Horrors stories, or I always loved the Vecna's Head story too.
Yeah, that one's fun.
So, but yes, Tucker's kobolds, man. So yeah, so Zobeck has a large kobold population,
right?
And the kobolds kind of oscillate between entertaining, like levity, and Tucker levels of terrifying vindictiveness to the pink skins who live outside of the kobold quarter of the city.
Yeah, I feel like goblins have kind of replaced that within sort of the cultural zeitgeist for being a clever machinist kind of character.
Definitely. World of Warcraft has helped that a lot. I think Paizo's embracing of the goblin as their mascot for a lot of things has definitely helped that a lot.
Yeah.
Goblins definitely occupy that in the wider world.
Yeah, even Dungeon Siege was doing it also. They're sort of independent of those.
Oh yeah. I forgot about that game. Been a long time. So yes, so I worked on those, and I it gives it that Eastern European flair, through the gods, through the setting elements, the names, right? That's part of it. Like, I never have a problem coming up with names because I just kind of figure where I am looking at that map, and I say, okay, that's kind of Bulgaria, Eastern European names. I'll go grab a bunch of those names. Oh, this part is kind of French, Normandy kind of space. Okay, I'll grab some of those names, and it works pretty well that way. But Eastern European is the basis for a lot of the Midgard myth.
So in your survey, you mentioned that the gods are kind of split into these like different masks for different places, but there's always like the same number of them.
Yes. So that was another part of cracking the code. But yeah, and they like to have 5 prominent gods for each region, and if it's a pair of gods, counts as 1, because like in the elves have a paired set of fertility gods, Urilla and Poravit, and they count as one.
Okay.
But there's usually 5 sets of gods, and then like 2 or 3 dark gods per region. And they will say, oh, like for instance, in the Crossroads, the god of war is Mavros. Or I should say in the 7 Cities region, it's Mavros. But in the Crossroads, they may say that Faerun, well, someone from the Crossroads would say Mavros is a mask of Faerun. And someone from the 7 Cities would say Faerun is a mask of Mavros. And someone who lives in the Northlands would say both of them are a mask of Thor. While someone in the Southlands might say that that's a mask of Horus.
Okay, so this is a very typical like syncretism idea where these are
Absolutely
the same god, but just with different traditions in different places.
Absolutely, yeah. Very syncretic kind of. It feels like late antiquity kind of vibe. The way the Romans might say, "Oh, this is Ephesian Artemis," right? Or this is, a Celtic Apollo kind of thing, where they would grab somebody from one of the Celtic tribes on, say, Romanized Britain and say, okay, this is the, oh, I can't remember the tribes, but this is the Apollo for this particular tribe.
Right. Yeah, I forgot about like the epitaph is what they called it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that part of it.
Yeah, and so that's kind of how it works. And so when people are like, is Thor a mask of Mavros, or Mavros a mask of Faerun or whatever? And usually when you answer that on the Discord, the answer is like, yes. And they're like, so which one is which? Yes.
Well, and the Calamar had an interesting take on that, where they have all the different names for the different regions, right? But then the name itself is like the Thunder, or the Thunder Lord, or something like that for the Faerun, Thor, Zeus character.
And the book has a list of that, and it will say, who is generally considered to be a mask of who and in what region, right? And that gives you a little bit to like translate back and forth, to kind of give an idea of different regional requirements. And that's the thing. The gods are usually like, they have what they demand from their followers, but it's not like they're active, but not necessarily terribly involved in the followers. I like that part of the world book where it kind of says this is what they want from their followers, but it doesn't like say, okay, it has to be this way. And I like that some of the dark gods are even part of the normalish pantheon. Like in the 7 Cities, there's the goddess of love and lust. And she's usually kind of darker, but she's a very popular goddess in that region. There's a vampire kingdom, and she's super popular there.
Okay.
That, I think, works nicely with that, because it talks about the worshippers, and it actually gets into a lot of that minutia for like clerics and devout, so that a player can very easily hook into some of that and build out those details with their character, which I appreciate for the setting.
So from a religious perspective, not necessarily from gods, but like from the way that the people interact with them, that's going to vary based on the region.
Yeah.
And be largely like, for a common person, they're going to be devoted to like the local pantheon, at least the good gods of the pantheon.
Yeah, for the most part. Again, depending on region. That's also one of the things I really like about is it's much more regionally bound, as opposed to some settings where they break things up like this is the elf enclave and these are the dwarf enclaves. And there is a dwarf kingdom, right, in this space. And there's a dragon empire. But most of the time, if you're like a dragon born in Zobeck, people, and you're known to be like a local like that, they're not going to treat you the way they may treat a dragon born from the Dragon Empire, which is more militaristic kind of empire, right? Or if you are a half elf, which they call elf marked in the setting, right? If you're an elf marked from the Crossroads region like Zobeck, you're going to be, still considered kind of a bumpkin, as opposed to a more noble-born person that you would be considered in the northern Holy Roman Emperor equivalent of Dornig, right? Dornig is a remnant of the Elvish Empire, because all the elves got up one day and just left. And Yeah, that is the interesting part of the setting. Although when they did the 10-year revision, some of the elves came back. They all went off to the Summerlands, but some of them came back. But for the most part, at least early on in the setting, there was one elf empress left, and she was the empress of Dornig. And she had a ton of elf-marked grandchildren, kind of thing. There were not many elves at all. And even then, half-elves or elf-marked in Dornig were considered, kind of noble-born. But if you were an elf-marked growing up in the Crossroads region or from the Seven Cities, you would be considered, that bumpkin from the provincial outlands.
I see.
It's very nationally driven in that sense, which I like a lot better.
Yeah, kind of. There's a lot of discrimination that I feel like goes just based off of language that feels
right.
In some cases, like just how do you get around that issue? Because talking with people is important for interacting with them.
It's 100% right. And the setting does have a common tongue, which I always find kind of, beggars disbelief. Just I've worked on enough things where it was like I worked on one book that was based on Ethiopia, and the number of different dialects in Ethiopia was just insane, right? And when you look at just Europe, like the differences based on language are all over the place. But you can't, like the way the game system works for D&D, you can't have a character with like 5 language proficiencies that's not like super high intelligence. Like there's not a lot of mechanics in picking up spare languages. So we have common, right, as our hand wavium to avoid the communication problem with a bunch of different party members. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Right? It's the Latin of the setting. And that's one nice thing I also, though, like about the setting is they go through and they have different languages for the regions. And the languages will give slight bonuses to different things. If you speak the language, you might get a bonus to interact with different NPCs, or you may have a benefit to diplomacy and some things. You may have a benefit to, I think it's Draconic. Like if you speak Draconic, you might have a slight bonus to knowledge Arcana roll. It's not huge, but it like gives a mechanical benefit to saying this is why my character chose to speak these languages, because this is their focus and these are things that this language is good at doing.
That's cool. It's a lot of systems don't do that. It just feels like it's kind of you spend points in a language and the purpose is almost like to lock other players out of an activity if you actually get to use it.
Yeah. To be able to have the control of the translation of the conversation.
Yeah.
Much to some other players, just frustration.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't speak Dwarvish. Well, he told us we can't go this way.
Yeah.
Not unless you pay him 50 gold.
Yeah, I think that's the real issue with like trying to have realism for languages is that often it ends up not being fun.
No.
And that's why we end up having Common or French or whatever, Latin.
Right. And that's I try to reward that. Like I did do some adventure design for one. Like there was a whole very political adventure where you interact with some of the fairies in the fairy realm, and we tried to put in things where if you spoke to them in Elvish or you spoke to them in Sylvan, because the first time we did the adventure we did it in 4th edition, right? So if you were talking to the Eladrin in Sylvan, like they gave you a bonus, right, to various interactions and checks. If you spoke to some of the elves in Elvish, you have a different bonus. And it was like to try and reward people who were thinking, about how they would communicate with people. I always remember that from one adventure where it was like, well, this poem totally rhymes in ancient Sulawese. It doesn't rhyme at all in what I've written here in English, but in ancient Sulawese, this totally rhymes.
Oh man, yeah. There's some poetry that I've read that, or just like songs, like in Japanese or Chinese, and it just feels like people like this. And then I remember that but it doesn't rhyme, and it doesn't have like the pictorial element to it that also contains like part of the expression of what the poem is.
Totally, yeah, no, exactly. You can get some of that. It's the little details I really enjoy about the setting as well. That's a big one for me though. I like the little language bumps in there.
Mhm. You mentioned a couple different regions there, like the Seven Cities and Zobeck. What are the different regions like that, and what kind of identifies them? I mean, a
Sure.
analogy
Yeah.
to Earth, I guess, is where you were going with this, and
Yeah.
I
No.
think that's easier to understand.
Totally. So the Midlands, right? Midgard's primary kind of region is that fantasy blur of Europe, right? So the Crossroads region is kind of like Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia region, right? That's where the deep dark woods of the Margrave is. Baba Yaga is there. To the north of that, though, is the Blood Kingdom, which is a vampire kingdom, and kind of right in the spot where you would expect Transylvania, except they're a lot more militant.
All right.
And then north of that is that remnant Holy Roman Empire type place, Dornig, right,
Okay.
which is that leftover. And so they're very political, German princedom type space, right? When you start to go a little over from that, you're in kind of where Normandy, France would be, and that is a slightly French, slightly English, remnant wizard city state. The history of Midgard is pretty well developed over about at least a 2-3,000 year period. The creation myth is the old Norse one, but I should wait and finish the map before I go into the weeds, right? And then as you head south from Bemia, right, which is that Normandy kind of space, where the Alps would kind of be on the map, is actually a wasteland left over from a magic war, which is why I started to go down the history path. And
Okay.
instead of huge mountains, it is filled with Cthulhu-esque great old one kaiju who
So
are right. That's the
still a kind
leftover.
of barrier.
Exactly. And this is supposed to be like a magical war wasteland, right? That these kaiju are frozen or immensely slowed down in time. So they move like maybe it lifts its foot off the ground in a week, and maybe it moves its foot, you know, a yard in another week, so that in 20 years maybe it walks a mile, kind of thing. But they move really super slow, and there are cults of slightly magically warped goblins that set up around them because this is wasteland, right? This is meant to be your kind of post-apocalyptic kind of messed up space, kind of in the middle of the map, the remnant of this huge war. And that takes up, right, that space. And then as you head to the west, you have kind of a Spain equivalent. Well, it's like the Provencal, right? Southern France slash some of that region right there.
Yeah.
And then you have a mountain range, and this is what kind of cracked the code for me, is then below that is the haunted lands of like ghost giants, which goes back to Spain, because in Spain, when the Romans took it over in antiquity, they used a huge amount of hydraulic mining that would carve these enormous caves out of the mountainsides where they would mine out silver and gold out of Spain. And so then in the Middle Ages, right, the medieval period, that all that Roman mining was forgotten. And so they said that there had been these huge giants who then disappeared and left the mines behind. And that was where I had made the underlying check, was the lands of the ghost giants in Midgard, mapped to kind of roughly where Spain was. And that's when
Oh,
I
okay.
started to put that together. But then you have the lands of the ghost giants and a jungle region below that is kind of part of Spain. And then we head over. The Seven Cities is your Italian city-state kind of space, remnant of the Roman Empire that had been the seat of the Elvish Empire before the Great Retreat, where the elves just woke up one day and said, you know what, we're not going to fight with the human wizard kingdoms that have broken away. We're just going to go home. We're going to take all of our stuff, and we're going to get up, and we're going to leave, and we're going to go back to the Summerlands, and you humans can keep the place. And then there's like an Amazonian type It says Amazonian. It's Peronalia, which is a very matriarchal dominated. I say kind of Amazonian inspired in more of a Wonder Woman Amazonian in that it's woman warriors are a big deal in Peronalia, and Magyars, which are inspired by like Thracians, and that's kind of in the spot where Greece might be. And
For
then
the Amazon thing, were you trying to
yeah,
differentiate it between like, Brazil or between
yes, yeah,
Wonder
no,
Woman
totally,
and like
yeah, like the
Greek
Greek myth,
Amazon?
yes,
Okay.
it's like the Greek myths and Wonder Woman kind of myth of Amazonians and not, although Wonder Woman not so much, but that idea of the Greek myth of Amazon as
Okay.
opposed to like, you know, jungle Amazonian.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. That was what
Yeah.
I was assuming, but you
No,
sort of
no, totally.
hesitated there, and I was trying to get some clarification.
Words are hard sometimes.
Uh-huh.
And then there's kind of a Black Sea analog, and with a evil despotic, not Constantinople, and then you have the Dragon Empire, which is basically put together by a dragon who realized it easier to band together with other dragons and maybe make smaller communities pay you protection money instead of burning them to the ground, and he built an empire. And so you have he was the dragon Maharot, and he made the Maharoti Empire, which is on the surface kind of right. It is kind of a Ottoman Empire-esque, like it draws inspiration from there, but the history goes totally off the rails, right? It's the barest flavoring of an Ottoman Empire type space, but really this Dragon Empire. And then where you have Egypt, it's really kind of super powerful wizard, but Egyptian inspired space.
Uh-huh.
And then there are nomads across what would be, the not North African space. And Minotaur's kind of, there's a Minotaur kingdom in kind of where Crete might be. Centaurs roam the far eastern plains out into the edges of the Midlands, and there's kind of a Azamar Persian-inspired country that is right there on the edge that is locked in the current war with the Dragon Empire and suffering badly. And then way to the north, where you would expect your Norse influence to be, is a whole set of various Norse Viking-inspired various kingdoms that have raven folk and bear folk and dwarves and trollkin. They don't have orcs so much in the setting. Orcs are kind of like a magical wasteland creature, something like where people have been warped by magic. There's
Uh-huh.
no like half orc or orc races in the setting, really. There's trollkin, and
Is
trollkin
there
are
hobgoblins or no?
no, not hobgoblins do exist in places. They've been used in different adventures. Trollkin are meant to be a little more like if you humans and trolls, or they're not quite trolls. They're like humanoid sized troll folk kind of deal. And they fill that niche within the setting. There's also in Zobeck like a not Warforged, and I was there when they because the two settings, Gearforged are the Midgard setting ones. They're different. They're more like if you ever watched Full Metal Alchemist,
Uh-huh.
the way Al's soul is bound to the armor, a humanoid soul is bound to a Gearforged body. So
Okay.
it's originally a person, and then they make this transformation into a Gearforged. Although as the setting has developed, they've also started to come up with, created Gearforged, which are much more like Warforged. As anything grows, I mean, at this point, it's coming up on 20 years
Right.
of development. Settings build and grow and fold in on themselves. So the Gearforged have seen a lot, and even then, they've had like half Gearforged, which are character heritages that have, basically got magically powered prosthetics derived from Gearforged. There's a really cool one. The guy has those helicopter blade like legs kind of thing in the art. So there's a lot of really cool stuff with that in the setting that I enjoy.
Yeah, the Minotaur one seemed a little I guess unusual because that's not typically a race that feels like as it's presented, typically intelligent enough to construct a society.
No, yeah, no, you're right. That and gnolls also are a common race in the
Hmm.
setting. And neither one of the generally player character races. But the gnolls really are known as outstanding sailors. Their culture,
All
yeah,
right.
right? Yeah, not I think Kryn had good sailor minotaurs in some regional space, but in Midgard, um, the Minotaurs are really renowned as sailors and oracles, and they draw a lot of inspiration from Carthage, or at least the sections I got to work on, and I got to work on a couple different regions for them.
Okay.
I really drew the influence from what remnants of Carthaginian Punic culture still exist in the archaeological record. Different things.
Yep.
Um,
Not much.
not a ton, not a ton, but there's at least one city when you look at the map. If you've ever seen ruins of Carthage, you'll be like, hey, wait a minute, that looks really familiar, and that was intentional.
I loved Carthage when I was learning about Roman history. It's like
Yeah.
the one like power that came close to breaking Rome, and I'm not quite sure why Hannibal didn't, but
Yeah, that trip over the Alps was just a little more than he was planning for, right?
well, it's more just like he gets to the cities and then he doesn't siege any of them. He just beats all the armies in Italy and then just kind of hangs out there for 10 years and then goes home.
I don't know what to say. It's somebody, yeah, clearly he thought something we missed. But yeah, that's I dug it. Like we did different stuff, kind of a mix of Crete and Minoans and Carthaginian. Tried to mix them all up in there, to kind of give uh, that mystic vibe for them.
Right.
So, and then I worked on the Southlands, which is, although it's usually published as its own book, it's the whole not African continent that heads down in there.
Um, I guess I had a question like related to other campaign settings, like in Faerun, like the Sword Coast gets all the attention, and in like Pathfinder, Aveston, like the Inner Sea region gets all of the attention. Is there a sort of favorite region in Midgard that the Kobold Press is going towards, or maybe that you like best?
So I have a super soft spot for Southland, but it's huge, right? And it's tough to really focus because Africa's, and even that inspiration material is so huge. But there is uh, just a metric ton of material based on in the Zobeck Crossroads region, right? There is a large supplement detailing the city. Tales of the Old Margrave is like a bunch of adventures based out of the enormous forest to the north of the city. The Dwarves of the Iron Crags, huge supplement. Well, not huge. It was like a 96-page supplement to the Dwarven region to the immediate west. Like the Crossroads region, you could sit and do years of adventures in that space and never run out of material to do things. There's an enormous spreadsheet that's maintained on the Facebook group for Midgard that really goes over a lot of the because people like Arabian Nights style adventures. There's a lot of stuff across the Southlands that leans into the Arabian Nights and Egyptian themes.
Uh-huh.
And that helps because they had the Southlands Kickstarter and they've done a couple of anthologies there. But really, the Crossroads region has probably the most, because even stuff that like deals with the Shadow Fae, which are like they're like a group of elves that made a pact with a shadow power, and they've kind of warped to become these tiefling-esque elves who are bound to shadows, and live in the plane of shadow, but occasionally visit Midgard. They have their start there near Zobeck. There's just Zobeck, right? The Crossroads region. That is the shining jewel of the setting. There's just so much to do there between Streets of Zobeck and everything else that's there, Margrave, all of it. There's a ton of adventures there. I would say, I mean, we tried to do other things. One project I did for early Pathfinder with Midgard was called Midgard Tales. And what we did, we tried to basically give a cross section view of all these, all the way across the setting, right? We tried to include an adventure from the Northlands, from the Wasted West, and an adventure in Dornig, and an adventure in the Seven Cities. Like, we tried to hit as much as we could all across the setting, so that if you wanted to kind of get a vibe for these different regions that was more than the 4 or 5 pages that might be in the campaign setting book, you had an adventure there to go to and see something of it. That was a fun project to do. The other thing that I really liked was in that same project, we did something called Midgard Legends, which is where everybody kind of contributed a page worth of material. And under the hood design thing, a page of an 8.5 by 11 RPG supplement is about 750 words. Right? So we told everybody, okay, you get about 750-ish words, maybe 600 words if we're going to try and stick a picture on there of whatever it is you're designing. And here you go, right? It needs to be mostly setting. It should be barely mechanical. Maybe it's a feat, maybe it's an item or something, but you're effectively going to just be telling a myth about something in the setting, which I loved because they went all over the place to design all these things to basically give all these like rando history elements from all across the map. It was great. And so they tried to give that, but if you want just pure depth and detail, the place to go is Zobeck.
And you mentioned like the gear forged as, similar to Fullmetal Alchemist, where they have the sort of mechanical arms, or like Alphonse. I mean, you mentioned Alphonse, I guess, as a soul transferred, but I guess I'm going more towards the tech version where Edward has prosthetic limbs.
Yep.
Is that kind of thing also happening with people?
Yeah. So the history in the setting for Gearforged is that they are a relatively new race of people, although later on, right, they talk about them being in a different form in the Egyptian equivalent in Nuria Natal, called Shabti. But in the Midlands, they showed up about 100 years ago when the free city of Zobeck revolted against their king, and they were losing until the priests of Rava, the Weaver, goddess, who's the goddess of invention and mechanical devices and innovation, gave the gift of Gearforged to the rebels, and they took a bunch of these older freedom-wanting partisans and they performed the ritual of gear forging on them, and they had this whole Iron Legion of Gearforged, who then turned the tide against the king and turned the city into a free city. And so there's a mayor and there's, a council of essentially like burghers. I'm forgetting the exact term. And the city is kind of a democratic anachronism in the middle of otherwise kingdoms all around it. And that they're there because the Gearforged basically helped them win their freedom from the king. And so they have this place of honor in the society. And it's a ritual that, costs a ludicrous sum, the way those things do in role-playing games. And people can convert over to being a Gearforged from being a normal person. And
my assumption would be this would be sort of a form of euthanasia, where like when you get critically ill, then you're transferred into one.
One of those things, or you're on your deathbed, or you're going to be dying soon. Like there's in fact an adventure about somebody who is dying, and he wants to be converted over, and so you're going. But somebody's stolen the memory gears that they need in his Gearforged body to then perform the ritual to transfer him into his Gearforged body, and you have to go steal them back. Yeah, it is effectively, right? You basically, in this ritual, you kind of die and are reborn, and your soul and your memories transferred over into the Gearforged.
Well, that reminds me of, I guess, another aspect of religion, but like a lot of polytheistic religions are more like transactional for their relationships.
Sure.
Where, I do this and you give me that. Whereas more modern religions that we typically follow in the Western world are sort of ethically based, like here's a set of rules that you have to follow instead of
Totally.
Burn an offering and I'll give you something. It's more be a good person and I'll give you something.
Right.
Where would you say the gods lie in that respect within Midgard?
They're definitely closer to the transactional level. Like if I take a look at Rava, for instance. So Rava demands her followers be wise and hardworking, that they prize learning and leadership and the making of new things. She demands her followers seek out new learning and steer the world to peace and plenty. They must defend the city against the threat to the clockwork Oracle identifies. She despises sloth, idleness, and luxury. Whereas, like, Voland is more of he demands that they craft great works in his name and stone, metal, and fire to will, right? And this is set for all the locals. For Faerun, Faerun wants action with an exclamation. Worshippers are expected to seek out battle and keep their martial skills well honed. Perfect death for a follower is on the battlefield, or death of old age. Followers must attend the mysteries at his temple before any great battle or long journey and never abandon a body on the field. So they kind of lay this part out. I would say it's more transactional. There's some behavioral to it, but these ideas of sacrifice and specific tasks in the name of a god that is magically present in the space, they may not always be clear in what their demands might be, and they may be removed in that sense, but there's very clear transactional element. I do this because I am a worshiper of Rava. That's why part of why I work on this project, because this is what Rava demands, and I know if I do what Rava demands and later I've done well, I should be able to ask for the gift of going and becoming a Gearforged, and church recognizes those elements, or maybe I have through my invention enough money to ensure that I am able to become a Gearforged and continue. So I like that about the setting. It gives I think, I'm going to say clear, but it gives at least a good framework for those underlying motivations.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. The Gearforged also sort of begged this other question of what's the tech level for Midgard?
Solid, yeah. I mean, there's a certain level of clockwork within Midgard, within Zobeck, that doesn't necessarily exist other places. The dwarves have some airships. The dwarves can have firearms. They don't try to lean too much into the firearm element of it. Some people don't like guns in their fantasy or airships in their fantasy. So they're mentioned, but they're not heavy duty. Early stuff, we really liked a lot of that clock punk element, but it was early aughts. There was a lot of clockwork, everything.
Are you sure this world isn't based off of Final Fantasy?
You know what? I would have to ask Wolfgang, but if he's got that secret, he's not sharing. At least that wasn't one that they talk about. But yeah, we got not like there's no gun blades, or at least not more than maybe a dwarven axe,
a gun hammer.
Right, a gun hammer, a gun axe. But I always look at those and laugh because I think about whether or not a good hit or a good parry is going to put my barrel out of alignment, and then it's going to explode in my character's hands, and that feels terrible. But I'm that kind of nerd.
Oh, I also think of just like, bayonets. Is it really that different?
Yeah, no, totally. And I think there are actually a couple historical, instances of like pistols built into the the hilts of the guns or of swords to allow somebody to shoot and then start stabbing, right? And but it's usually around 14th century. Maybe a little bit higher around Zobeck. I like to think of Thief the Metal Age or the Thief games as a close equivalent kind of space. Crossbows are still probably more effective than pistols, just because of the difficulty in generating powder still and the prevalence of magic. It was fun. Actually, I did some of the early articles designing for the airships. They wanted to have the airships, and I didn't want them necessarily powered by magic. So I created an ore that when you dissolve the ore with acid releases like hydrogen, basically. So that also let you blow up airships if you really wanted to.
Okay.
But I gave them, I called it lift gas ore. And so when you dissolve these rocks with acid, it generates the gas that is lighter than air and to fly overhead. But it also made something that you had to mine. And it also, I think they would dissolve under boiling water or something, whatever it was, so that I forget if it was acid or boiling water, but when you submerged it in that, it would generate the gas that let the airships kind of fly. That was a fun dive into like early dirigibles. They had some really cool ones in France.
Well, along the lines of like technology level, like magic level is also, I feel like, an important part of our fantasy world. So what's the magic level of Midgard?
That also kind of depends on the region. But like, and this is always a great debate, because I remember having this like when I did some stuff for Paizo or for Living Greyhawk, was like, right, detect magic is it's a first or it's a 0 level spell depending on your system, right? Which would mean you almost might have the equivalent of like detect magic metal detectors in certain places to kind of weed out some of that danger.
Yeah, I did that for casinos in my game.
Right? Like that makes sense if you want to make it super prevalent. That kind of is a decision you kind of want to make as you start play, is like, but like in Midgard, in Bemia, I would totally expect that, because this is like a city of, run by wizards and wizard schools and wizard guilds, and that is like high magic space in Bemia. But like in the Blood Kingdoms, the vampires probably convert, spellcasters that they find into vampires so that they don't turn on the vampires, and which makes the magic really not prevalent within the common folk, right? Because it's all kind of hoarded away for the vampire elite. And there's probably a median level of magic, I would say, in Dornig, because they have this culture that is, nobility driven, but those nobles want artisans who create nice things. And so your level of like hedge wizard, for lack of a better term, right, is probably a little more so. Mm-hmm. In Zobeck, and Zobeck really punches above its weight regionally in terms of power. Right. There's probably a little more magic in that town between the Steamworkers Guild, who make the Gear Forge, and the Church of Rava, and the different paladin orders. It's definitely higher magic, but it's meant to be a little more gritty. So those things exist, but they're not like magic shop prevalent.
Yeah,
I don't think we ever really, like, even when we kind of put a potential magic shop in the setting, we left it open to the GM's interpretation as to whether or not this guy was a total charlatan or a real, wizard setting up shop. In fact, that's one of the big tenets of the setting, is that your Midgard may vary, right? you can tune that dial up or down on grittiness or magic or whatnot, right? To try and find the level of it that best suits your table.
Oh man, there was someone in the RPG design subreddit that was saying, "How do I stop people from like messing with my setting after I publish it?"
You don't.
Yeah, you don't. People are going to play with your toy you built for them how they want to play with it.
That's a great thing I learned working with Wolfgang as we did this stuff for the primary setting and then even for South, right? Is that proper setting design, at least professionally wise. And I, listening over different episodes here, I start to see where people do a similar setting design for their own ones, but they start to focus and they develop their setting in the direction of the game style that the style of play that their table kind of, starts to evolve into. But
right.
For the professional settings, you build your setting to try and be as inviting as possible to as many folks, but you also have to build it with the way we put it is powder kegs. You have to put all these places in for them to break it, right? You need to put places where people can show up and start things on fire and blow things up and break them, because that's where all the conflicts are going to come from, right? So that's where we build in the conflicts that destroy the status quo, that change the direction of how things are going to be, that lets your Midgard may vary, right? They have to, because otherwise it just all stays the same, and well, that's just boring.
Yeah. When I was writing my own campaign setting, whenever I got to a new city, I would write how they got their food, what their trade, what they were like exporting, what the government was, one inn in town, and some sort of conflict that the players could engage in the city.
Solid. And that's a good, right? You need a good baseline like that. We would make little nation stat blocks, right? That kind of talked about the major towns, might talk about the major trade, kind of gives rough breakdowns if like there's because it's very pluralistic, right, in the nation. So you'd say this is human dominated, but here are some of the other groups that are in the town, or this is elf dominated or dwarf dominated or whatever. But there's lots, different heritages that exist within, different communities, and you kind of break part of that out. But you'd also talk about like, okay, they do trade here, these are the communities around it, or some of the farming is. You try and put that stuff in there so that somebody can show up and kind of get a vibe for the region enough to look at the map, look at what you've given them, and kind of be able to move, do something. You have to give them enough to then start moving around and give them enough hooks and enough powder kegs so that they're like, okay, I see. This guild doesn't do well with this order of clerics. This set of, the spy guild has, machinations to take over for the mayor or whatever, right? You got to lay all that stuff out there so they've got those things depending on how the table decides to go and break it, right? If they're going to go find out where the Thieves Guild is, or if they're going to go look for who the power players are, or, they want to see where the bandits are raiding the farm to squeeze the town from the outside. You gotta lay all that out ahead of time, and it sounds like, you gotta set at least the bare bones of it to know where your group is then going to start to grow and then build it out from there.
There was something you said earlier about like trying to create a setting that's welcoming that I wanted to expand on with a bit of a curveball question for you.
Sure.
So Kobold Press, like my imagination of it is that it's kind of the modern generation of role-playing companies. Like we had sort of early stages like TSR, and like Steve Jackson James and other small organizations like that are making like paperback books that are black and white. And then we moved into like the Wizards of the Coast era with, big, glossy pages, full color, lots of art.
Sure.
And now Wizards of the Coast is kind of, I wouldn't say exactly fading, but the market is getting bigger and they're sort of keeping their slice, but there's lots of other slices that are sort of forming and getting bigger on their own. And Kobold Press is one of those new slices. And part of the newer generation that I've noticed is trying to be more ethical in their production.
Sure.
Not necessarily with like how they're making the books, although that's great too, but in how they're writing the world itself.
Sure.
As an example, like Pathfinder for Galarian recently decided they're no longer going to do slavery.
Okay.
So they tried to eliminate like institutional slavery. And there's been a lot of push to like eliminate racism. So that goes with like, okay, goblins aren't bad anymore. It's just like there's regional conflict related to them. Or like wizards started to like push against sexism by, in the older rule sets, like women would have lower stats, for example, and that's been largely eliminated in modern.
Oh God, yeah, we haven't seen that since second edition. But yeah,
right, yeah. Like there's been slow push to try and include more and more of that. Like there was the wheelchair item in one of the D&D books, and
sure.
There's like the neutral gender language that's being used. Like Pathfinder, for example, like switches based off of like each different character class is like a he or a she, and just keeps switching back and forth, kind of.
Sure. Yep. I've seen that too.
And I guess I was curious about your take on that for Midgard and Kobold Press as they're presenting Midgard.
The setting is definitely evolving, right, over time. And I certainly don't speak for the company. I'm a freelancer in that regard, right? I've just been a long-time contributor and watched that space evolve, right? Mm-hmm. The setting has had in the past has certainly had elements of slavery, or forced indentured servitude, depending on region, right? I think it's a tough choice whenever you're doing the design, from my own opinion, regardless of, because I've also worked on projects for other publishers that included elements of things like slavery or elements of discrimination, right? And
yeah,
often, right, those elements need to be clearly identified in the setting. I think they need to be provided with options, right? They should be clearly labeled with safety tools whenever possible, right? They should be an element of a pre-game conversation with the table that ensures that the folks playing are either comfortable incorporating those themes into the game or not. And if they're not, right, then there should be options to eliminate them, that fit nicely within the setting. For instance, they're captives. They're captives who, will be, ransomed, or, they are captives who are a temporary state here, right? Or resettled into a forced resettle, which even that has, not necessarily a great option, but there are other options, right, for how you want to present the material. And you should present that with clear noting for the table. And I know that that's an element, certainly when we did Midgard Tales, right? There's a fairy tale wedding adventure, to which, we put a warning label into the beginning of the adventure saying, hey, this has got these elements. Converse with your table ahead of time about these themes. Decide whether or not this is an element that you really want to put in there. I think when you treat the players and the tables as adults capable of identifying what material they want to engage with and don't want to, and you clearly label that material in your setting with potential alternatives, it gives a lot of nuance to your material, because let's face it, some of those elements make for great, terrible bad guys.
Yes.
Right? Great in that they are a very clear, awful evil to struggle against. Right? They're an unambiguous evil to struggle against. Right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That was some of my thought on eliminating slavery is like, well, but that you just like took out Cheliax, like the big bad guys, like
Totally. And that's, but you can put an alternative to that that says, okay, they deal with, the way, so the Ironcrag dwarves have something called, I think it's 10 years under the mountain. And that's that they will take prisoners of war in conflict and hold them for 10 years as hostages. And then after 10 years, they let them go. That is not quite slavery. It's kind of slavery, right? It's a very weird slavery light. But it's a cultural element that the dwarves have. They still have rights as this. They're not, it's more of an antiquity kind of indenturitude as opposed to chattel, which I don't know that's necessarily all that
I
better.
think the Moors during like the Middle Ages were doing something like that. It was a 7-year slavery for.
And if you converted, they let you go immediately.
Mm-hmm.
But that was also why they tried to keep their prisoners illiterate, right? If you can't speak the language, you can't convert, and then I get to keep you, right? It's awful, but there it was. But this element, right? All of those elements, that discrimination, that forced imprisonment of other sentient peoples, right? The active aggression between nations, right? All of this provides very clear enemies for heroes to struggle against. But all of those things need to be a part of an opening conversation with an established set of tools agreed upon by the table. Maybe they don't need anything more than, a hand gesture or no, I'm not cool with that, right?
Mhm.
Between a player and a GM. Maybe they need an X card on the table. Maybe they need to fill out a survey, right? To figure out where they do lines and veils or where they draw their boundaries. Like setting those boundaries for the table in a modern table with a modern RPG is essential, right? And within your setting material, you need to clearly note that material ahead of time so that people can either skip it or even skip your product if they want to, or put in alternatives into your material if they're, because some folks are like, no, I don't need it anywhere near it. I don't even want to know what your substitution is. I don't want it, right? And that's cool, right? There's a lot of, like you said, this pie has grown much larger even within the third party space, right? Which gives them room to go to those other alternatives. But for other folks who feel like, no, I want that option, even if I change it slightly, they need to add those elements to it to give opportunities to the table. And we shouldn't deny them the mature agency to make those decisions ahead of time. We had, as you can, I'm sure you can kind of get from me on this. I had extended conversations with the folks from the Moonsoon campaign that I worked on, because they had villainous elements that employed, forced imprisonment. And these were folks from Southeast Asian culture, where that and colonialism were elements of their past. And as we were working on elements there, we don't want to shy away from this. We'd like this to mirror our past, so we want to incorporate these elements. And they ran into difficulty finding, they found a publisher who was willing to work with them, but it was a progress, right? It was an adventure for them, literally. I mean, they already had a bit of a diaspora from the Civil War that started as they were, finishing out the project. But even afterwards, as they were working in this distributed kind of team, trying to find a publisher who would work with them with the setting that they had created based on the inspiration of their history and their past, which included these elements. And the conversations we had, like, you've got to incorporate that. I think Kobold Press has definitely recognized that not all of these elements are always appreciated by everyone at the table. I think though a lot of their focus, especially for the last 2 years, right? Not even, maybe, I guess it hasn't been 2 years since the OGL debacle.
Yeah, it has.
Wow, right? Pandemic throws everybody's scale of time off. At least it has for me.
Well, I think part of that is because the D&D Beyond debacle was pretty recent, so it's kind of a repeat of the similar. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so with that, they've placed an immense amount of their focus on developing out Tales of the Valiant, right? Which is meant to be what Pathfinder was to 3.5, right? Taking that initial baseline and then finding the places where they could polish out the rough points and improve upon it and place their own stamp onto the system in certain ways so that it is both new and yet familiar. I love the term jamais vu, right? Which is that exact feeling, right? That it is both familiar and yet new. And I can't claim having discovered that, except there was a very kind reviewer, Southlands, at one point, that it was new, and I love the term. I've kept it in my back pocket ever since. But I think that's what Kobold Press is really focused on. But they've also tried to create, with this idea of the labyrinth, a multiplicity of settings, right? That allow for a broad number. I mean, certainly they haven't forgotten about Midgard. Right now I've doing a series of web posts, right, to build out part of the setting in bite-sized chunks, and they've done that for years now. But their core focus has been on building out Tales of the Valiant, and with that, the Guide to the Labyrinth, they're looking at an enormous number. I think the Guide to the Labyrinth was something like, I don't know, 100 very shortly, described settings to give people an idea of different worlds with the whole premise of the labyrinth. And with that, I know they were looking at trying to find stuff that hit all across the spectrum of different kinds of inspiring settings, right? That was very inclusive. They've done a great job, I think, in trying to be as inclusive as possible. I don't think they've forgotten what brought them, to the dance in Midgard, but I think their focus has been more to building out Tales of the Valiant. What the future holds for how Midgard develops, I don't know if they'll find that it's if that's something that they want to keep in the background, or if they want to, adjust those elements of the setting or whatnot. They've always been really good about an equity of male and female NPCs, of gender roles. That's always been an element that I've found really well to there, but they don't tend to shy away from that regional discrimination that you can get into, but between nations that are at war or at friction, and they also have not had, they've never eliminated that element of forced imprisonment that humans have proved so terribly good at through history.
Yeah, one way of putting it.
I mean, we're awful. Humans are really awful. I mean, we're wonderful, but we have no humans. That's a long walk for that answer, but I spent a lot of cycles thinking about it, I have to say.
Feels difficult to bounce from that to something else.
I would say the reason I also draw from part of that is because I've done historical settings, right? Like my work with Ars Magica is set straight in the middle of the Crusades, and that was an element in there, and so that tough part of finding a good balance to find good gameplay. That it goes back to that idea though of talking to your table, right? And I know you like. I mean, I'd say the segue, the advice that I would say most important, especially as you get into the people building their tables, is to have that conversation with everybody of the kind of gameplay they want to have early on, right? Set that expectation of, we're going to do hex crawl, I don't want to say murder hobo. We're going to do hex
hack and slash. That's
hack
the
and
style.
slash. Thank you. Yeah, we're going to do hex crawl, hack and slash, or no, we're going to do some political intrigue in the city, right? Set at least an initial outline, and you're going to go off into the weeds, or you're going to have, palate cleansers here and there for adventures. There's going to be a heist in there somewhere. But when you set those, you start to have part of those expectations, especially around, the elements that folks are comfortable seeing explored in terms of their villainy. That's really that core explanation. Don't ever be afraid. The one I always like to say when we do design work about any system or anything else is just because previous designers have done it wrong doesn't mean you have to do the thing, right? Whenever you're running the game and the way the handles a situation or something else, never be afraid to change it to something that you think works better for your table. But for gameplay especially, have that conversation about the level of villainy that is okay.
Yeah. I had another thought about this whole thing here is that one thing I think designers have to remember as well is that people are going to be discovering your books in the same way that you did for D&D, where like you're like a 10, 11-year-old finding the book and not really having adult guidance for it, or you did, but it was sort of not just stop instead of being reasonable guidance. Yeah. So like having those extra parts of the book that talk about how to be respectful of the real people that are playing with you, or in your community that might overhear what you're doing, and if you're playing at the library or something, and then they get like some horrible interpretation of what's going on, to keep that in mind as you're playing, so that you don't make a mistake that makes someone uncomfortable.
Yeah, sidebars are cheap, man. Put them in there. You know, as you're doing that, and it's less so when you're just doing friends around the table. But even then, we forget about that because everybody's comfortable usually with the people at the table, and you're like, these are my pals. I need to think about this. All these folks here are we're all friends. Why should I bother with that conversation? And you have that conversation very specifically because these are your friends.
Yeah, as if you've never had an argument with your friends.
Exactly. Like, please, let's just talk about what happens after a Final Fantasy, or I should say a fantasy football draft, rather.
Right,
I've had some very strong words with people about their choices for wide receivers.
Yeah, got that on your mind. Yeah, we're recording this as the season has recently started, so.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, that's what I would say. That's how I would segue.
Well, I did have a couple more questions for you, though.
Of course.
I'm going to keep you captive for a little longer.
I am conversational hostage taker. I am happy to talk about this all day long and twice on Sundays.
All right. Well, I have one more question about the setting before we got more into like the sort of your perspective of it as a DM and as a writer. And that was about the sort of world-spanning organizations for the setting.
Oh, those don't exist. I love that they don't exist.
Oh, okay.
We'll get people who show up and be like, where are the Harpers? Or, where are, the Harper's the big one out of Faerun, right? Where are the, trying to think, there's a similar one to Harper's in Greyhawk, but they're more in the Keeland region.
The Circle of Nine, for example, though, like all of Mordenkind's friends.
Right. And they'll say, well, where are those in Midgard? And, I will say they don't exist. Like the game is like the setting is very intentional about the fact that things are at a very regional, national level, right? That there aren't these huge continent spanning organizations. The Order of Mavros in the Seven Cities is different than, say, the Order of Mavros in the Magyar Kingdom from the Order of Faerun in, say, Zobeck, right? These different orders have similarities, but maybe they're just in the regions, and that gives them certain powers within those regions, and maybe the surrounding area, right? Maybe they start to get designs to expand their influence, but they're not like there's no world-spanning organization. The closest they have to that is the Cults of Ragnarok, because it does lean heavy into some of that Norse myth. The creation myth for the setting is the whole Norse, death of Ymir and into Midgard kind of thing.
Yeah,
right?
making it out of the bones and the blood and all that.
100%. And then with that is the concept of Ragnarok, that Midgard will be destroyed through Ragnarok and Fimbulwinter and the whole nine yards. And so the closest they have to that is this idea of cults of Ragnarok, but those are like anarchic, world-ending cults that don't really make friends with each other. They're not like a clockwork, band of world destroyers bent on, bringing Fimbulwinter and Ragnarok about. Each one of them is trying to do it themselves because they all want the favor of Fenris or Jormungandr or Hel or whomever to do this. They don't want to share with anybody else, so they don't play nice with each other.
I'm thinking of like a real world equivalent here would be kind of the Catholic Church during the medieval period, where it's got all these like connections to all the kings of the various kingdoms and all the different holy orders from the Crusades that are connected to it.
Yep.
But yeah, a lot of these sort of international organizations aren't quite that's realistic compared to what we have in the real world.
Totally, and it's because Catholic Church was the spiritual. I say spiritual, but right, they were the inheritors of the Roman Republic, right? They stepped into that of the Roman Empire, right? At least in the western half of that, they stepped into that power vacuum, and provided that religious advisor, but yet structure that went around. But even then they had certain differences between, the Celtic Catholic Church in there, and because I had to deal with it, right, there's the differences between the Greek Orthodox, right, elements and the Roman Catholic elements, even to the Coptic Church in Egypt or the Ethiopian church down in Ethiopia, all in that 13th century frame, right? That's a lot of diversity even within the 13th century, where it's almost primarily Christians, Muslims, and Jewish, those three Abrahamic faiths in that whole region, right? And that level of organization just isn't there in Midgard because of the mask, for one, because of the regional tensions, for two, because there is not a single unifying faith across the entire Midlands. And people kind of like, oh yeah, Thor is Faerun is Mavros. And somebody else is like, yeah, no, Mavros is Faerun is Thor. And then the other guy's like, no, Faerun is Mavros. Right? So they all are kind of speaking similar, but still kind of different. And that keeps that.
Yeah, we should all be unified, and by unified I mean you should do what I say.
100%, exactly. And no one wants to sacrifice that agency.
Well, yeah. Let's skip to hearing about your experience as a DM and as a writer. So you've run mostly modules, is what you said in your survey. Is that right?
Yeah. And I say that because all right. So my hack and slash Wednesday/Thursday night group is a long series of, I don't want to say random, but vaguely random encounters in a hex crawl type style, interspersed with various pre-generated modules that I kind of tailor into the environment. My groups that I've run in the Midlands, right, of Midgard, because I helped do so much design for so many years, I'm familiar with all or a ton of the published adventure sets, right? On a bunch of them, I helped do the design.
Yeah.
So
I was thinking a module isn't quite the same thing for you as it is for me when you've had a hand in writing it.
And so I've built out arcs of these where it's like, okay, I really like this particular one that I know Rich worked on. And so I'll use that as like my. Then from there, I may go into one I helped. And then from there, there's another one out of that I'm part of, but I'm really familiar about it because it's part of the playtest, right? And then that'll go into another adventure that I helped contribute to and maybe did conversion work for. And then that'll lead into another one. And so I have these arcs of pre-designed stuff, but to me, they don't feel pre-designed because I was there. I was there when the words were spoken,
Hmm.
kind of thing. And so that makes it really fun to do, because I'm usually really familiar with the setting in the different places, or I know where to go. I kind of have the vibe down for, and it makes it a lot of fun to run, because I can then lean into how the players interpret encounters or interpret sections, and I really enjoy it. But I don't want to say that only comes from being a designer for it. I mean, folks that have read or run read the adventure through several times beforehand, I think that they get the same level of familiarity with it, right? Then it becomes a lot easier to tailor or even, uh, adjust on the fly. Um,
Yeah,
and,
definitely.
and often, right, in our more modern time frames, we're super busy between families and jobs. And so it can be tough as the GM to gain that level of familiarity with the material. And so that leads folks, Tomb of Annihilation, or Wild Beyond Witchlight, or Rime of the Frostbane. Those are big books, and that's an investment of time to get familiar with it ahead of time. I mean, Rime of the Frostbane drove me berserk when I got to the point where it was like, okay, everybody's 4th level, and come back to me when you're 7th. Good luck. That drove me berserk. Because it was like they kind of left me to my own devices, not additional threads or hooks or powder kegs in there to put the table to work. I ended up trying to shoehorn in parts of Storm King's Thunder to do it, and in the end, the table was not thrilled with trying to play that story out, and we ended up just I ended up engineering a transportation into the ultraviolet grass.
Or just level up to level 7 and be done with it.
I guess I could that too. But I wasn't, I didn't, I could just say, okay, and now we're 7, and then continue on with it. But I was trying for more of the authentic experience out of that.
Right.
And that
Yeah.
goes back to what I said before, right? Is if it's not working for your table, feel free to break it, right? I should have just listened to myself and said, okay, everybody, you do some tasks working for this guy, and when we come back next month, you're 7th, and away we'll go into the next chapter. But I was trying to stay true to the form of the book, and therein I did not listen to even myself, and I should have, because we probably would have continued on with it, because it's got a lot of fun stuff in there. But I tried taking them into the 5th edition revamp of Barrier Peaks, and they didn't necessarily enjoy the fantasy robots in there.
Yeah, I was thinking that's I don't want to say an acquired taste, but it's something that you have to know your players are gonna like.
They did not like the robots in their fantasy, the robot chocolate in their fantasy peanut butter. And I was trying to replace the Spelljammer with that crash ship and do some stuff in there, and we did some of it. I think I got through a level and a half, and they were just like, yeah, how long till 7th? I was like, do you guys want to go back to like the hex crawl stuff we did before? Do you want to try and finish out this story? And they're like, we don't even really remember what this story was supposed to be about back before. And I was like, that's fair. It was a long walk, and we cut over to that. I find, getting familiar with building out the arc. I remember listening to one of the GMs who talked about, deciding where his final battle was going to be, and then walking back the steps to that to a certain point. I think he figured out from 15 to 8, and I think you said something similar to him at that point of, hey, just start at 8.
Yeah.
And he was like, but I want to build them up from 1st to 4th kind of thing, and then figure out where to go from 4th to 8th. And yeah, I wanted to try and do that, but once you've gotten familiar with that material, that's the toughest part. I don't think they ever mentioned for the GM is not necessarily planning out those battles, but I mean, of course, the first and most difficult task, right, is coordinating the schedules to earn the true prize of your session.
Yes.
The true game. That's what I told my son as he started role playing with his own friends. I'm like, son, the real game is coordinating your schedule. The treasure is your session afterwards. But the second one then for the GM, right, is building out your arc and getting familiar enough to be able to flex it on the fly and to know where you're going with everything. But that's our modern life, right? Is not having enough to necessarily do that whole planning ahead of time, or even be which way you want to go and be familiar with it enough to flex it along the way as the players take you straight into the weeds that you never expected. Who knew that they would use control water that way to destroy the waterfall and cause a massive flood to the town downstream? Who would have expected that? But there it is. Now I'm dealing with a disaster of the party's creation. And how does that change the whole plot?
Yep. There's, the emergent storytelling is kind of what the new Powered by the Apocalypse and narrative-based games are trying to do, but it definitely still happens within more structured simulationist games. It's just harder to arrange.
Yeah, your trad RPG stuff tries. I mean, it ends up showing up. It really depends. It's when you start to go more sandboxy, right? Sandboxy encourages the emergent, but then even as a table gets more comfortable with just where it's playing, it'll start to show up without. It's a feature, not a bug, right?
Right.
And the longer the tables play, the more likely it is that kind of thing. And that is a section that is not always. It's not a lot of words on that in the DMG.
I feel like the 4th edition DMG was very good at actually including those lessons.
That was, DMG and DMG2. That one definitely went into a lot of newer places. They suffered from a system that just was too foreign to a crowd that really wasn't ready and they tried for a feel that was very, very MMO inspired, that I don't know that their audience was ready for either. And that's how Paizo eats their lunch for a few years.
Yep.
But I still have those books sitting here staring at me across the table. DMG and DMG2, I've gone back and looked at them a few times. They've got a great thing in there about looking at player types that is clearly Robin Laws cribbed out of his 12 laws of role playing, but still it's way cheaper to find out of a DMG2 for 4th edition than it is to go find a pamphlet.
Yeah, for sure. What would you say sets Midgard apart from sort of basic D&D, both in the sense of rules and the stories that you can tell that are unique to the setting?
So I'd like to think it has ley lines, right? There's a lot of travel options in there that let players move around the setting a lot without having to necessarily resort to teleportation. And in fact, in the core write-up for the setting, there's not really supposed to be teleport. You're supposed to use these shadow roads that are effectively tied to ley lines that allow you to go great distances quickly.
Okay.
Right? So you can kind of work that out to see the world as long as you make the bargains to use the shadow roads. And that can be tough initially for players to kind of figure out, because they're like, well, what do these look like? How do they operate? What do you do with them? And that's not always it's there, but it's not the Midgard World Book is a tome. It's something the World Book is something 450 pages. It is a doorstop of a book, and it's just dense with things, so it's easy to lose stuff in there. But I think that ability to kind of easily move around the setting is a great feature of it. It has some status rules, which I appreciate. I don't always know that they are. They could use more support in adventures, but the status rules are great in that you could start to make people famous in regions, through their actions and bump up their local status. And There's ways to mechanically do that in some of the adventures, but not all of them. And it's nice, right, to kind of work that up. But yeah, no, you're really well known in cities, but over in the Crossroads region, they're going to be like, sir, who's it? Like, why should I know you? And that's got value to that, right? And I like the regional elements that are fleshed out enough to really give some rich local stories, which, yeah, you can go see. I think they jokingly used to call it adventure tourism, right? To go to the different regions and come back home. But you can do some good local adventure that are easily supported. And I don't necessarily have to go all over the world to do a really good arc beyond the Seven Cities or beyond, Zobeck, but I can. It's got some very good OSR bones underneath the more modern 5th edition rule set that is definitely more approachable than the 3.5 Adolescence and Pathfinder Adolescence that it really grew up out of.
Is that where Tales of the Valiant is going? Is more of an OSR kind of game?
I don't know. I have the book sitting here. I recently got mine delivered. And I got to go in and really devour the changes. I think they're trying for a heavier. They're trying for like I said, a polished out. I would hate to say 5.5. It's meant to build off of 5th. Take the best parts of it that they like the most to adjust the portions that they didn't feel had been done as well as they could have been done by Wizards, and give their own spin and feel to it.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like Pathfinder for 3rd edition.
Yeah, kind of like Pathfinder. I will say it has been something that we've encouraged in freelance and in projects all along, like as long as I've been contributing to it. And I blame Ars Magica because they really made me do it in my projects for there. But their material tends to be very story seed heavy, right? And I watched a great thing from a guy who used to be part of the University of Chicago writing program. And he was teaching for academics. And his whole thing was that for academics, you needed value. And I kind of convert that over for role-playing games to say that the products have to have utility. They can be wonderfully written. They can be wonderfully descriptive. They can be wonderfully clear. But if they don't add utility, right, then they're useless. And the best way you can have utility is to tell people the kinds of adventures that generate with them and to give them of adventures to run. And I feel like Midgard has always been really good as they generate material to put a lot of story seeds in there so that when you're getting those products for setting materials or other things, that they're giving you a lot of baseline hooks to put things together to run good stories. It's not just read this and then figure it out. I've read a lot of settings, and when the designers forget to put in story hooks, man, that to me is that's the most frustrating thing ever for a published setting. Like, you should be inundating me with story hooks.
Well, yeah, I think there was something I read about like RPG design is that you need to design a rule system, right? But you also need to design like a module that you can release alongside the rule system so that people have something they can do when they pick it up.
100%. And then, I can think of one setting in particular that ended up waiting a year and then kickstarting the anthology that should have been out same time as the setting. It's a beautiful setting, but man, it was a brawl reading through that to try and figure out what I should do with it, like what kinds of tales to tell. And then they came out a year later and and here's the anthology adventures. Aha! Well, better late than never, because it was gorgeous. But man, I shouldn't have to comb that hard.
Right. Yeah.
To find the corn in the setting.
Yeah, and I think like one of the things that a recent RPG book I read was the Marvel Multiverse one that came out last year.
Yes.
Where they had an introductory adventure. It was 6 pages, and they chose not to include that in the book. It's an online download.
That is bold strategy, Cotton.
Yeah, that was my thought, is that this would have been so easy to just print 6 more pages and have something that people can jump into and do instead of having to Google and find this adventure, because it doesn't even have a link to it in the book. It was such a weird mistake to make.
And who knows, right? It's so strange because you never know. Once things leave your hands as the designer and enter the hands of the editor, who knows what decisions get made.
There were a lot of things in that book for the Marvel Multiverse that seemed like this is not something that the author wrote. This is something that the Marvel comic team put in here because they want to sell comics, not RPGs.
That could be. I know at one point, as I was earlier in my freelancing, do a script for machinima.com that was based off of the conquest of Middle Earth. And the first one I did, I started to write the whole thing in Quenya. Just that elf.
Okay, yeah.
And to do it with subtitles. And when I gave them my first touchstone, the guy was like, "This is awesome, but I don't think the internet audience is willing to watch a foreign film in machinima."
Yeah.
And I was like, that's fair, right? And then later on, I made another like an offhand comment about how the Ents had turned against the humans, because Sauron had promised to give them the Ent wives, and that did not make it past the review from the estate. They were like, no, you don't even get to hint at this. Take that out. So, that happens definitely, where some great ideas do not make it past the editing and IP review, and there's not much you can do about it as an author. One of my good friends that I've done a lot of writing projects, he had his start in screenplays, and it is a lesson that has taken me a while to learn. I feel I'm much better about it now than I was at the beginning of my freelancing career, but that is that you have to let go the minute you turn over your manuscript. And you can run whatever it was that you at home at your own table if you feel it's the director's version is better. But you also, if you would like to freelance again, you should be very happy about whatever it is that they took from your manuscript that actually makes it into print.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's
that's
plenty
how you do.
There's plenty of screenplays that have felt like they have been messed with when I watch them. The most egregious one was the most recent Robin Hood movie.
Okay.
Which seems like it was a rejected Fast and the Furious script.
I always like to joke with my same screenwriter friend. We had, because he was telling me the giant clockwork spider in the, I guess it was late 90s, the old Wild Wild West.
Yeah.
That was some producer's third attempt finally to get a giant clockwork spider in a movie. He had pitched this giant clockwork spider in 2 other movies, and it had been turned down or it had been written out of the script as they started to do things. But for Wild Wild West, it finally stuck. And so that's why we end up with the giant, enormous clockwork spider chasing Will Smith through that version, is because somebody really wanted that, managed to get it brought in from the outside after the fact. With the strangeness that comes with that. But yeah, you got to learn to let go after you turn it up. Who knows? Who knows what will come out the other side of editing?
Right. And you mentioned Ars Magica a couple times. What other systems have you used within Midgard that felt like they were a good fit?
So I've used 3.5 Pathfinder, 4th edition, 5th edition. All of those. I've done conversions. 13th Age has been used for Midgard.
Ooh.
There's a whole set of icon for 13th Age from Midgard. In fact, there's a couple of published adventures page in Midgard.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah. I've done I've done conversions from 3.5 to Pathfinder to 4th edition to 5th edition of a few adventures. There's one that I desperately want to convert to Blades in the Dark, because it's a heist adventure that just begs to be converted over to that system. I mean, I've run it in 5th edition probably 8 or 9 times, and I love it in 5th edition. But I've also found as I've run it more and I've played, I got a good, I guess it was a half dozen sessions of an arc of Blades in the Dark under my belt, for a while during pandemic, and I loved it. And just looking at that system, man, that particular heist adventure just cries out to be converted into it. It's a great Arabian Nights, Ocean's 11 style heist of, and it needs to be turned into Blades in the Dark. I've seen folks convert stuff over to Savage Worlds.
That's
and
pretty
run
easy.
a bunch of that. Yeah, and I haven't tried myself, but I gave it a really long look for doing some investigative stuff in the city. There is a supplement for Trail of Cthulhu called Lore Finder that was meant to give a Pathfinder vibe to Trail of Cthulhu.
All right. I thought you were going to do, say, Swords of the Serpentine there, but okay.
I have not gotten a chance to look at Swords of the Serpentine, but I've heard really great things. And I think is that Kevin Culp?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, he does fantastic work.
Yeah, no, I've loved his stuff.
It's been nice. I mean, I have to say, I have not been able to go to Gen Con since 2019. So I often will feel a little bit out of the scene for designers and whatnot. But those guys I got to talk and meet a bunch of them, which was crazy early on because you're just rando freelancer. But at Gen Con, there were chances to meet and talk with all these guys at different times. And it's tough not to fanboy a little bit. Like you mentioned, the Marvel Multiverse. I think Matt Forback worked on that one.
Yep.
Matt's awesome. I got to meet and talk with him a few times at Gen Con. And it's so weird to get to do that. You just, I don't know. You try not to squeal a little bit, especially if you get to talk to him. You're like, oh my God, I'm talking to Matt Forback about something about games. One time at GaryCon, sit and talk for like 45 minutes with Jason Bowman from Paizo about, I don't remember, I think it was elements of, system design. And afterwards I was giddy. That's the other thing I love to have, but that's part of Ars Magica. I think Ars Magica has probably the best magic system, hands down, of any, for just flexibility and
It's in the name.
It is. They don't call it Ars Gragica. It's Ars Magica,
Yeah.
and it's fantastic that way.
I think that's something that's really nice about the D&D community is that at conventions, game designers are so accessible. They're at a table. You can walk up and talk to them.
Oh yeah. I remember once during the 4th edition years, I was doing some stuff for Kobold, and oh gosh, it was one of the 4th edition designers who had been on and I came to talk to him, or I'd listened to the panel, and then afterwards I walked up and I was asking him about a 4th edition martial artillery build, about trying to do one of these because we'd been doing something on a Kobold project, and I really felt like there was room in there to generate this 4th, this martial artillery kind of character concept that would be a really interesting character build. And and he listened very politely to me, as I kind of discussed that. He didn't know me from Adam, but he was willing to entertain the conversation for 10-15 minutes at Gen Con and discuss part of that design, and he did honestly listen, to what I was saying. He's like, yeah, but I don't think it's got a wider use. It doesn't fit with the aesthetic that we really wanted to go as part of the core rules for it. He's like, good luck with it. Because the limited publication space we had with the GSL in that point. But,
right, yeah.
But, I mean, Kobold did put out a chunk of 4E stuff, and we got to do some experimental stuff. I mean, that's doing that kind of stuff was what really made me say, just because wrong. Doesn't mean we have to. I don't like to hold any kind of sacred cow on any kind. I'm willing to break just about anything to give it a try once or twice. But yeah, that was the nice part of Gen. It's always the nice part to go to Gen. I mean, as long as you're considerate of their time and friendly about stuff, and, remember that they don't necessarily know who you are and you're polite. They're always very welcoming and conversational.
Yeah.
That is a thing.
Just be a human. Recognize when someone doesn't want to talk to you anymore.
Exactly. When it's clear that like they need to go use the restroom or, gosh, they could really use a beverage of some kind. They would like to go now. Please, Marvin K. Mooney. And carry on about their convention. You should let them do that.
Or the line behind you, another example.
Yeah, that too.
Well, man, anything that you feel like we missed that you wanted to talk about?
I mean, you let me take you hostage for quite a while about so many things. It's stuff that I'm certain you've had a number of folks say a bunch of different times. I will say, somebody looking for, just a great example of a book chock full of like setting ideas kind of thing. There is, I think his name is Andrew Kolb. He did a book of Neverland and of Oz, turning those into 5th edition-esque settings. Gosh, those things are jam-packed with utility. I absolutely adore them. Take a look at those. Those are great. I mean, don't get me wrong. I absolutely adore Midgard. That place is second home to me. But as somebody who's always hunting for great settings and how a great most utility, the GM at the table. And I think that was something your previous GM, John, had talked about, where he would steal things. Oh my gosh, so much good stuff to steal out of Oz and Neverland.
Yeah, that's funny. I was just watching Peter Pan before I came to do the interview with you with my kids.
Oh, we don't talk about all the musical numbers, but yes.
I did have a discussion with my wife before, like, do we want them to watch this movie? Like, I loved it when I was a kid, but now I recognize the problems.
There may be some parts in here that maybe we fast forward next scene, or we talk about how this is not okay. But yeah, no, his book on Neverland, fantastic. Like it has whole elements for how to treat TikTok the crocodile as you're moving about the island. His Oz is a larger scale, but very similar. It has sections for procedurally generating certain portions so that you can make these like regions that are unique every time you visit them. That's really nice. He's one of those totally scary individuals who's not only a good, solid designer for a setting type level. He doesn't get into a huge, but there's enough there, right, to find where it meshes with 5e, but also a great evocative artist. So I would really take a look at that one. Other than that, I have to say, super excited for there's going to be an Ars Magica Kickstarter or backer kit project, whatever they are now.
Yeah.
On the 15th of October. So I'm super jazzed because they're talking about making Creative Commons, and I worked on a fanzine for Ars Magica for a ton of time. So all this stuff that we've had stuffed away in a tiny fanzine, maybe we get to put together and put out there in the world for printed finally.
Yeah,
so
that'd be
I'm
cool.
super excited. Yeah, it's years of stuff. But yeah, keep no sacred cows in your RPGs. Break all the rules that don't work for your table. Put that on the front of every book. Everything in here is allowed to be destroyed for the sake of your table.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. And you already kind of gave your DM advice at the earlier bit.
Yeah. But otherwise, no. This has been, like I said, delightful. Like I said, I am a student of settings, so I probably have a good 40 or 50 around that, and I've read through and looked at it. That's why I've devoured your entire podcast, because it's great to see how people do their own individual design. It inspired several conversations. It's great work that you do here, and I think it's awesome to give people that platform and opportunity to share their, the GM's version of let me tell you about my character.
Yeah, exactly.
such utility from it, right? It's neat to see that. So please don't stop anytime soon. Great service you have here.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Ben.
I appreciate you being able to give me a few times because I don't necessarily have that home. Man, this has been fun.
After wrapping up with Ben, we talked for like another hour about game design topics, and it was a lot of fun. Loved having him as a guest, but it didn't quite fit for like a Midgard-focused episode. So that's something that I might release in the future as like an extra bonus episode of some kind. Ben also offered to do some co-hosting stuff for me in the future, and I haven't taken him up on that offer yet, but I am looking forward to doing that when I want to focus on more co-host content, where similar to the first episode I did with Will, where we looked at Lord of the Rings, I'd be doing something like that. Anyways, what I wanted to show here is just a little bit of that conversation I had afterwards with Ben. And I hope you like that as a little bonus on this episode. And thank you for listening.
So you were working on a setting, or you're working on a game?
I'm trying to find a game that'll work for like a Chinese story.
Sure.
I found maybe 3 so far that seem like they'd work for some sort of Chinese story. One of them was Righteous Blood, Ruthless Blades.
Got it right here. Yep. That is a good one. That was what I was going to suggest.
Hearts of Wulin is the other one I'm reading now that looks like a good fit.
That was a very narrative-driven one, if I recall correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's Powered by the Apocalypse, so yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And the third one is Ironclaw. Also feels like it's a decent fit with the Jade Claw supplement.
Have not read that one.
Oh, okay.
It is a little more whimsical, but I do have Doe, Pilgrims of the Flying Temple, which I really enjoyed. And that might not be a bad fit. That has that kind of... It's a little more Ghibli, slice of life, but it has that kind of roaming across the countryside vibe that I feel like is often invoked in those stories.
Okay.
So, and that was Daniel Solis, who has not been as active in the recent years, if I recall correctly, but really good designer.
Yeah. I'll take a look at that one. That's a good recommendation. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I heard the one where you were asking about Qin, the Warring States, and I have that in case you have not yet found a copy.
I have since found a copy and read through everything except the lore section because that was
sure
good, but I mean I already know a lot of that. Well, not. It actually gets really detailed. So
it does. It does indeed.
Yeah.
I picked it up for research at one point. So yeah.
It does seem like a good book just for like figuring out stuff, like just doing research on that period for China, I guess. Like a lot of what I was like checking pieces of it, and I was like, yeah, this is actually accurate. They're not just like making up shit here.
I could sympathize with them, but yeah, and that was part of why I took a look at it because I was interested in seeing what someone else thought was important for gameplay.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, okay, let's take a look see. So
yeah, and I was excited about the 5 element system for it, but it ended up I got a little let down by it because it wasn't doing like the whooshing connection. Yeah. Really, it was more just like we're going to kind of map the 5 elements onto sort of D&D stats.
That is, yeah, I concur. There was a big opportunity that I felt like they missed. But yeah.
I still liked the yin yang die rolling system. That seemed really cool compared to like it makes it feel sort of like that. And the way the stats interact, it's all like there is a balance that you want to have for what you're doing.
Sure.
So that part made sense, and the spells were very much like, oh yeah, all of these are like, I know the story that's from, or the folktale remedy that's supposed to be.
Huh? See, I was not that deep. So I looked at it, I was like, all right, it really feels like they're hitting the right theme here, but it's good to hear that they went that way.
Yeah, it was a very well-researched book. But yeah, I feel like Go ahead.
I was just saying, I always feel like that is an important, right? I am a strong proponent of the well-researched RPG book.
Yeah.
So, any case. So, that was things that it came up, though, where I was like, I have that. So, I was listening to different episodes and whatnot.
Yeah, the one that I'm having trouble finding for my Chinese RPG research, or would be very expensive to find, is
I know that music. I know that music well.
Yeah, the Conan the Barbarian RPG had a source book for
Cafe.
I think they call it Kitai, but
oh, yep, that one too.
Yeah.
There was I may actually have that. Let me look.
Oh my god.
I have a basement that is effectively a RPG library wonderland. Let me see if I have Kitai. No, I do not. I have the comic book. I have the comic book Arc of Demons of Kitai.
Okay.
I have Handy Library, which I find is wonderful.
I figured you were doing something like that.
I have the whole library. Like, so during pandemic, I basically one day, one shelf a day, went through and scanned everything. And so, yes, let me see if I have Cathay or not. No, I have a bunch of the old Mongoose Conan stuff, but that one I do not. I have to ask my friend. He ran a ton of that. That had a very fun system. I stole liberally from their maneuver system, where it's like, if you have these feats, you can do these 4 or 5 things without anything else. Like, all it takes is just a certain base attack bonus and these feats, and here you go. Here's a bunch of fun stuff you can do.
Ah, cool.
So that was great. But yes, I have a ridiculous number of RPGs and source books and all kinds of things.
Yeah. Have you looked at anything else by Sanguine? They're the ones that made Ironclaw.
I have not. No, I've never even heard of Ironclaw before.
Okay.
So I wrote it down to go take a look.
Yeah, they're it's a sort of it's infamous for being the furry game.
Okay.
Where everyone plays anthropomorphic animals.
I just worked on a setting where that was the case. So, Ironclaw. I worked on Moonsoon, which was a 5e setting.
Okay.
And based in Southeast Asia, a bit on Burma, Myanmar. And everybody is anthropomorphic capybara or water buffalo or frog or bird or pangolin, or they have some like aquatic based races. One that's an octopus, one that's like kind of a fish folk, and then some cat people type thing or a fox people. It's a ton of anthropomorphic animals.
Yeah, there's so many in Ironclaw, and it's really easy to make your own as well. But yeah, because they all have sort of a formula for how they're doing it, so it's easy enough to just copy the formula for something new.
That's cool.
But yeah, the base book is for Europe, and then they had a China and an Africa book that they did as well.
Nice. I'll have to pull it up and take a look.
I'd recommend it.
I do. I am a student of settings, right? So that is why I was drawn to your podcast.